Today, the Lane Center is excited to host Carol McKibben, who will speak on the research behind her upcoming book, Salinas, The History of Race and Resilience in an Agricultural City. Dr. McKibben will discuss the historical development of Salinas, California, an urban center defined by its rural agricultural economy. Cities like Salinas that blur the distinction between rural and urban challenge our understanding of race relations and urbanizations, immigration, and political identity. Carol is a lecturer in the departments of history and urban studies at Stanford, where she has been teaching courses on California history, urban history, and immigration history since 2006. She's been an affiliated scholar here with the Bill Lane Center since 2020. A proud resident of the Monterey Peninsula, Dr. McKibben has engaged in numerous community-based research projects across the region for 30 years. Dr. McKibben will be joined by Michelle Anderson, the Robert E. Paradise Faculty Fellow for Excellence in Teaching and Education at the Stanford Law School. Professor Anderson is a scholar of state and local government law. Her work combines legal analysis, empirical research, and humanistic reporting to understand concentrated poverty and municipal fiscal disaster. We will begin by hearing from Dr. McKibben about her research, and then Professor Anderson will join in for the question and answer session. Audience members should feel free to put their questions in the Q&A function of their Zoom windows down at the bottom to participate throughout the discussion. The Lane Center is grateful to our panelists, and we look forward to a compelling conversation. Carol, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stephanie, and Marco, who's handling all things technical, and Michelle for your support and incredible new work on urban America that has really shaped my understanding of Salinas, and to Bruce Kane and the Bill Lane Center for hosting this event. My forthcoming book, complete now and due to be released in the fall, is called Salinas, The History of Race and Resilience in an Agricultural City. This is the story of Salinas, California, as a multiracial urban place built on agriculture and an identifiably ranching and farming community. The thrust of my argument is that Salinas exemplifies the blurring of the lines between what is rural and what is urban in America. We need to call those concepts into question, especially today when we too easily caricature rural and agricultural populations in polar opposition to the urban. There's truth, of course, to some of that, and we saw that as it played out all throughout the course of last year. But it really overlooks some important realities in our history and in our own times that I hope this book helps to address head on. This book is also a nuanced look at urban development that does not only focus on decline or marginalization or inequality alone, but on urban struggle and resilience in the face of a host of economic, political, and social challenges. So Salinas, with a population of almost 160,000 people, is the most important urban center in Monterey County. A majority Latinx city since 1980, but also racially diverse historically and today, and the county seat for Monterey. It's situated at the head of a rich agricultural region known as the Salinas Valley, about 17 miles inland from Monterey Bay and about 100 miles south of San Francisco. Salinas encompasses some of the wealthiest, the Monterey County encompasses some of the wealthiest places in the nation, including Salinas, and some of the poorest. It is defined by and identified as a place of great agricultural production. However, with some exceptions, Salinas and the entire Central Coast region has been overlooked by academics and scholars. So it's time for that to change. Salinas was the site of some of the fiercest labor battles in American history. It's home to multiple racial and ethnic communities that have lived side by side in a kind of a complex tension, coexisting, accommodating a kind of normative American white racial hierarchy, yet nipping at its heels. Salinas shows us how a typical American city, located in a rural agricultural setting, managed to sustain a complex social order. This is not a story of progress or decline, however, but of struggle to get America right, socially, politically, culturally, and economically, all the while facing some of the most difficult challenges and biggest crises of 20th and 21st century American life. As Ana Caballero, Salinas's first woman mayor and first Latina mayor of the city, said in 1998, "I always thought that Salinas was the microcosm of the state, that if we could do things in Salinas, you could do it almost anywhere in the state, because we had some big city problems. We had all of it. It's like a cocktail of the hardest things to do," right? So yes, Anna, indeed it is. In order to make sense of it all and to understand the significance in the context of urban California, I returned to the 19th century to expose the tremendous changes over the next 150 years that created a city known almost entirely for its 20th century conflicts over labor rights and race relations, but not really known at all. I began this work at the behest of then city manager Ray Corpus, himself a Filipino American, to write this comprehensive account of Salinas's history that utilized a variety of new sources, including new oral histories that might challenge the prevailing local narrative of this city as a failed urban space. Salinas, like so many of its counterparts in California, was the subject of publicity that focused on crime, gang violence, and in a mostly negative way, this new demographic of Mexican immigrant field workers who appeared to overwhelm other groups in terms of population numbers. It took me over a year to get access to some of these sources, and they included materials that were unavailable to other scholars in the Monterey Historical Society, Growers Shippers Association, and the library, from Salinas families from every ethnic and racial group. It provided me with more evidence than I could possibly have included here, but it gave me some special insight into the history of the city as it evolved over the course of the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. I had the leisure over the course of 3 years to pore over manuscripts, newspapers that were available only in hard copy, minutes from the Growers Shippers Association and the City Council dating back to the 1800s, and miscellaneous documents located in the basement of Growers Shipper and the Chamber of Commerce. Some of the reason that these sources were hidden away and unavailable was just due to disorder. Local archives just didn't have the funding or the bandwidth to organize their collections, much less digitize them. And so these incredibly valuable sources were unavailable for anybody's review. There was always also concern about what scholars might do with this material that nobody knew was in their archives. So what I found were two really important source materials. First, the Grower Shipper meeting minutes dating back to the 1930s were remarkably complete and unvarnished records of what was going on behind closed doors there. Then this newspaper called the Salinas Independent, only in hard copy, was written for and by working class residents, most of them union members, and they offered a window into the perceptions and goals and views of union activists. I combined these with ethnic newspapers that also provided important and varied perspectives on Salinas history. All of these sources taken together opened my eyes to a more complex understanding of Salinas and of California that helped me challenge consensus among historians about California urban history. I began to understand better that rural and urban were neither opposing forces nor neatly divided spheres. So when we talk about agricultural environments, we have to look at cities. And when we look at cities, we need to know if they're grounded in agriculture. Context matters, place matters, and it always has. I also began to appreciate more fully about that class and gender were important in understanding group dynamics, that class differences within, say, the Filipino American community in Salinas mattered enormously, as did gender roles, as did stage of migration. A good example of that happened in the 30s when the entire town of Salinas shut down at the behest of Filipino women's groups to celebrate and honor a Filipino war hero, Jose Rizal. These women were middle-class families, part of families of labor contractors who were well-respected and well-established, but they were also not included in the Anglo-American women's groups. But at the same time that this was going on, there were race riots because Filipino men had the audacity to dance with white women. And there were labor strikes led by Mexican and Filipino field workers, but opposed by Filipino and Japanese labor contractors who sided mostly with the Anglo-American growers. There was no one homogenous Filipino community any more than there is any homogenous community. And it would be a huge oversimplification to talk about Filipino oppression without the complicating role of the middle classes and the role of middle class women. New migrations in the 1970s added another level of complexity, dividing the community along lines of the stage of migration and experience and settlement. My challenge was to dig into and dispel these common knowledges and myths, and that begins with California statehood in the 1850s. I learned, in contrast to prevailing local narratives, that Salinas was not founded either by accident or by white men only. It could best be described as a tug of war between Californios such as Juan Castro, vying for Castroville to be the front and center city in the region, RMF Soto, who was another Californio who owned most of Alisal, a subdivision of Salinas, and who was lobbying the Southern Pacific Railroad to create a railroad stop there. And whites from Monterey and San Francisco and all over the place who were trying to create a city out of a stagecoach swamp a stagecoach stop in a swamp, which became Salinas. So Salinas won that argument. And it became, rather than Alisal or Castroville, the central city and railroad stop. But things were nasty and complicated. Another big battle came about between Monterey and Salinas over who got the county seat, and Salinas won that one too. The point is that Californios were not just conquered people. They were shrewd negotiators with their own agendas. They fought back, sometimes aligned with Anglo-Americans, sometimes against them and with each other. Everyone wanted a piece of the action from the railroad barons. I don't want to overstate that. Californios were also truly victimized and overwhelmed by post-gold rush Anglo-American migration and conquest, but they resisted. And that story of resistance is important and needs to be incorporated too. Things happened pretty fast after that. 15 people lived in Salinas in 1868, but 700 did so by 1874, when it became an incorporated, established as the county seat, and a stop on the railway. That was really fast growth. Although the population increased to almost 2,000 by 1880, demographic growth remained relatively slow through the 20s. Like other regions in Northern California, Salinas was defined by its diversity of population rather than just by the numbers. That happened almost from its inception, and it included populations of Californians, of Mexican, Chinese, Filipino, Japanese, African, and Anglo descent. They all arrived in the first decades of the 20th century and defined themselves as part of this agricultural world. All of these settlers were determined to remain in place, to build Salinas into a permanent community, rather than allow it to become an obsolete ghost town like so many other Western settlements. They did not share power equally. Anglos assumed control of government, but everyone navigated space within the city. And found ways to deal with this pervasive racism that was the order of the day. Salinas was also part of San Francisco's big plan to create a hinterland to support itself. It was a farm town, but with a flow of residents and money that went back and forth from San Francisco. And that flow of money was not just between big white agriculturalists and financiers, but everybody. So, for example, Chinese people weren't all laborers, as local histories indicated, but they were merchants who established tongs and support systems within Salinas and ably navigated city government despite segregation and brutal racism. So, one of my stories came from a little girl, then a young woman, Blanche Atai. She recollected her life in Salinas as part of a merchant class family. She went to public school and played baseball, but she also felt ashamed of her Chinese lunches. And she said she learned how to eat bologna sandwiches. She remembered how included she felt in the celebration of the rodeo when two of her cousins joined the family, and she recalled the bright lights that were so exciting and the rodeo parade down Main Street. But still, she lived in Chinatown. It was segregated. It was the least developed part of the city. Her story, and so many others like it, began to convince me that cultural inclusion mattered and may have even softened the blows that racism inflicted on minority communities. The question for me became, how significant was this kind of inclusion? Was it even inclusion? Was it just a facade, or did it mean something important? So I kept that in mind as I moved through history in my research. The 20th century history of Salinas might be characterized as one of dynamic change, where the city's identity evolved to accommodate a wide variety of ethnic and racial groups, and was first and foremost defined by ranching and farming culture within an urban milieu. The structure of government solidified. Organizations connected regionally and statewide, and women played a pivotal role in everything. So I looked at the story of Dr. May Gideson, who was a Danish immigrant to Salinas, a Danish American. She single-handedly established a regional medical center for women in the 1880s that has subsequently become a teaching hospital connected to UCSF called Natividad Medical Center. And it's still a public hospital in the county. I illustrated the development of the city through the lens of the emergent communities of Filipinos, Chinese, Mexicans, Anglos, and Japanese, all of whom made agriculture, especially lettuce, into this lucrative product, which in turn made the city the wealthiest per capita in the United States by 1925. Again and again, I saw evidence of cultural inclusion, but exclusion in other areas. So, for example, the society pages regularly announced events like the Japanese Association mapping its program for the year, and reported over 100 members gathering in downtown to celebrate the origins of Japan in 2594 and to celebrate a new park in the Japanese section of the city. So, here again, we see evidence of the contradiction between neighborhood segregation by race, clearly there was, at the same time lauding Japanese American cultural organizations and making room for a new park. I ended this section with the Dust Bowl migration, largely through the lens of families like the Ramseys, and specifically my favorite person, Mary Martha Ramsey Day, who poignantly recounted the hardships this refugee family endured in Texas when she was a child, and then traveling to California during the Great Depression. She was inspired by her mother, who she described as small but resolute and fearless. And she also talked about in 1930, the fall of 1930, selling everything the family owned, including their brand new car, and piling the kids into, a trade-in, a Model B Ford. The kids, there were 10 children, starting at 14 years old and going down to 6 months. That included a set of 2-year-old twins. You can only imagine what that looked like. And they started for Salinas, California. They picked cotton along the way. They lived in a tent. Their car broke down every 5 minutes. The end came in San Luis Obispo. She said that car took one look at the mountain and wouldn't go anymore. So her grandfather and uncles drove down from Monterey, rescued the family, and they landed in Alisal, which became known as Little Oklahoma in Salinas. There, Bill Ramsey was born in 1832. He would become one of the most prominent businessmen and civic leaders in Salinas. But first, he was part of this poor Dust Bowl migrant population. Mary embodied the migrant laborers that made up the crucial workforce in California agriculture in the 30s, and who became central to the history of the city of Salinas as part of a wave of defiance, challenging the combined power of Salinas's growers, shippers, marketers, contractors, and local business people. They also inspired John Steinbeck, whose graphic and compelling accounts of migrant farm workers' desperate lives in numerous newspaper stories and novels won him both the Pulitzer and Nobel Prizes and international recognition. He was deeply worried that California was creating this permanent underclass of agricultural, industrialized labor, and used the example of the 1936 lettuce strike, which connected Salinas to the widespread labor battles in California and the nation, beginning with the 1934 general strike that completely shut down cities from Seattle to LA. I complicated that story by showing that in Salinas, this effort was not driven only by men in factories, but by women in the packing houses who initiated the strike in Salinas over inequality in wage rates. And it was one of the many nuggets I unearthed through an examination of the records in the basement of grower shippers. It adds a new dimension to our understanding of those 1930s labor battles. I included Mexican and Filipino field workers in this part of the story, connecting Salinas to other fights in the fields in California. But I also emphasized again the role of Japanese and Filipino labor contractors as they were ascending into the middle class based on the labor of their co-ethnic workers, their solidarity with growers and shippers, and their creation of permanent communities within Salinas that the town as a whole embraced through cultural events and celebration. Cultural inclusion became a hallmark of the city of Salinas's life, disguising the reality of inequality in politics and economic life and the segregation of neighborhoods by race. As well, I described the association of grower shippers in the 30s. They were portrayed as this big, powerful force, but the minutes showed otherwise. They were more like a loose collection of small farmers, larger growers, at least in the 1930s, and related industrialists. And they constantly argued with one another within the meetings. They didn't seem to have a single strategy, such as the one over hiring a market broker. It's one of my favorite arguments. Mr. Storm said he thought that if the shippers could not get together now, after all the work that had been done, and after such a great majority were in favor of doing so, they were all a bunch of boobs and deserved whatever happened to them. So this showed how open they were about recording their meetings prior to 1937. They became a lot more strategic, a lot more organized and focused with the advent of World War II. And I tell that story of the war years and carry this part of the book through the civil rights era in Salinas, which is still a big part of the city's memory. The incarceration of Japanese Americans was a brainchild of Salinas and the model for California. I included interviews here with many of the survivors of that. Later, of course, the Bracero program impacted Salinas for generations afterwards. Their grandchildren still live in the city and shared important perspectives of the long-term effects of that program on their families. The activists from the Chicano civil rights movement that was first led by the Community Service Organization became leaders in city government by the 1980s. I looked at that movement by emphasizing how important it is to understand the power and significance of place, locale, context. The UFW and Chicano civil rights were not this amorphous agricultural movement, but very specific to place. Activists shared stories and memories, which I included in this analysis, like Olga Reina Garcia, who had just graduated from Alisal High School in 1970. She said, "We continued to work in the fields with no other thought of leaving." And today we cannot imagine children of field workers who feel the same way. They want to leave the field. And so do their parents. She said, "We talked it over with our parents. They supported our joining the union." And she really saved her biggest admiration for Dolores Huerta. Dolores was always at the rallies. She spoke to the crowds in the same spirit as Cesar Chavez. She could navigate a contract herself. Negotiate. The workers were present at the negotiations. She won the respect of many. She was the backbone of the movement. I juxtapose stories like Olga's with perceptions from other people outside of the UFW. Jack Armstrong noted with consternation how Cesar Chavez and the farm worker movement not only upended the city's identity in the most profound and public way, but also appeared to come out of nowhere. In a reference to the Filipino-American-led strikes in Delano between 1965 and 1970, he recollected how surprised he was, or how surprised everyone was, by the UFW in Salinas. "We were blindsided by Chavez," he said. "Delano seemed so far away." For most Anglo-American Salinas residents like Armstrong, but also for the multiple Asian American communities in Salinas, Cesar Chavez hit the city like a sledgehammer. No other minority community in Salinas spoke out publicly to support the UFW, although individuals did join the movement. Many residents described that time as civil war in Salinas. This was also, however, an era of environmentalism, and that tends to get lost in that story in the tellings and in the usual narratives. It was a time of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring and Nixon's establishment of the EPA, and Salinas was part of all of it. This was led by a Salinas housewife who was also a Stanford grad and a geologist, Ruth Andreessen. Ruth worked for the federal government during World War II on a mapping project, and she became a mentor and good friend to me. She has just turned 100 years old in December. Salinas wanted in the 1970s to transition out of such a dependence on agriculture, which couldn't employ people full time, and began annexing agricultural land and encouraging new industry to locate, like Nestle's, Firestone, Smuckers. And of course, there was always Spreckles beet sugar factory next door to provide employment. The Monterey County Industrial Development Committee was formed, and it was a business organization to entice new industry into Salinas. But it also created pollution. And the wives of these people organized under Ruth to challenge them. They didn't want to live in a soiled environment. And Ruth described it as, when you get up in the morning, you had the most delightful chocolate wind. And that was largely emanating from Peter Paul and from the Nestle plants. But it was really serious air pollution. I wanted to emphasize here, I emphasized in my book that this was a movement of white middle class women. They did not include environmental justice initiatives that might have also focused on pesticides, especially as these affected farm workers and their children. That doesn't happen until the 1990s. It was the threat of an oil refinery that really was the trigger for them. The Humble oil refinery was supposed to be established in Monterey Bay. It was going to produce 50,000 gallons of crude or 50,000 barrels of crude oil, a day. And that scared everyone because there were a number of oil spills in that era. So this could happen to Monterey too. But moreover, it was going to contribute to already serious air pollution. In Salinas Valley, the wind blows down the valley during the day. And at night, when the ground cools, the wind blows up the valley and out to the ocean. So with that unfiltered smoke coming out of the refinery, the Salinas Valley was going to be seriously impacted. So all of these women went to this Board of Supervisors meeting, and the meeting lasted 13 and a half nonstop hours until 3 a.m. with the supervisors approving the refinery. But in clearly, a way of challenging this as the women that they were, white liberals, they all cut up their credit cards and wrote letters, and the Standard Oil decided not to place the winery there after all. And I ended this section of environmentalism and civil rights by looking at the post-1965 immigration policies that opened the door to new migrations from all over Asia and changed Salinas's respective Filipino, Japanese, and Chinese communities within the city. These new immigrants replenished those communities with well-educated professionals and business people with means who had no historical memory of either marginalization or segregation or oppression. And that added a degree of conflict and complexity within these communities going forward. So we're aware of a flow of Mexican immigrants into the area beginning in the 1980s, which made Salinas into a Latinx majority city. But we're less aware of the impact of Asian groups who came in the wake of those policy changes too. Connecting those dots to contextualize these changes in Salinas makes it clearer how this urban place centered on a rural agricultural economy both exemplifies and challenges our understanding of our own recent history as an either or story of progress or decline, of urbanization and suburbanization, or agriculturally based towns and cities marked by population loss and failure. It isn't linear and it doesn't follow a nice pattern. Most important, I emphasize in this section that the new politics that came out of this civil rights era was significant in its moderation, starting with a pivotal election in 1987 that not only resulted in reorganizing Salinas into districts, but also in the first Latino finally elected to the city council, Simon Salinas, followed by the first Latina mayor, Ana Caballero, and an all-female city council by 1998. Dividing the city into districts as a result of census data that showed a lack of Latino representation felt off-putting to many residents, and it was really contested, but it was not radical. It did not emulate Chicago in the end, which was what everybody feared, in creating this politics of domination by one group. Instead, it exemplified how this rural ideology blended with urban life to result in a middle ground, in the persistence of all groups and neighborhoods, and a relatively strong dynamic economic structure, even within the extreme challenges of the larger economic forces of the time, the downturns, and the fiscal policies of that era. By the 90s, Salinas had some of the highest rates of crime related to gang violence and Soledad prison nearby. And fiscal belt tightening closed its libraries, at least temporarily. Then came the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake that nearly destroyed an already fragile downtown and upended plans for development. The city struggled to rebuild Main Street, pinning its hopes on this revitalization project, the National Steinbeck Center, that celebrated their once locally reviled author, John Steinbeck, in order to bring Salinas into what was then a billion-dollar tourist industry in Monterey. However, developers were reluctant to invest in Salinas, and visitors avoided the city because of the crime statistics. In 2008 and 2009, they were chilling, consistently showing double the murder rate of similarly sized cities like Oxnard, California, which shared a similar demographic. The rate of gang members in Salinas was almost 6 times the national average in 2009. And yet, Salinas came to grips with this problem somewhat earlier than most places because of a series of events in 2014. Angel Ruiz, Carlos Mejia, Frank Alvarado, Jose Velasco, these young men were unarmed and in some cases walking away from police when they were shot and killed. And it created a huge uproar in the community and outrage. And it led to a complete reassessment of the police department and new studies about the roots of gang violence connected to the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey. Significant changes in training, operation, and attitudes within the Salinas PD happened in the aftermath of those shootings, including the hiring of a police chief, Adele Frise, who is a Latina. And the study that ensued looked at all these factors for gang membership and noted high school dropout rates, attendance rates, employment, extracurricular activities unavailable, and housing density. And what was interesting is that what the study found was that there was a correlation between access to education and extracurriculars and employment, but that everybody was so concerned about housing density, whereas multifamily housing led to lower rates of gang activity because extended families served as a brake on gang membership. This study and this event led to some huge improvements in Salinas's educational system that supported the local community college Hartnell and the state college Cal State Monterey Bay, and was and is almost laser focused on STEM programs supporting agriculture, or ag tech as it is generally referred to now, reinforcing the idea of a rural urban community and bringing this study full circle. And then the COVID pandemic hit Salinas in the most powerful way. So even though there were systems in place to deal with it, Salinas was affected most of all in Monterey County because its population of field workers and service workers could not simply shelter in place or work from home. And Salinas has the highest rates of infection in Monterey County. The agricultural industry, which has always defined Salinas, also faced catastrophe because of the closure of schools and restaurants. But the city vision as a workable multicultural city, multiracial place, and first and foremost, an agricultural town prevails. It's not a tourist destination. And it was spared the bigger losses of the tourist centers in Monterey County. And it reimagines now its downtown secure in its agricultural identity and with its most famous son, John Steinbeck. The history of the National Steinbeck Center exemplifies that, and I go into that history. The politics of the city remains moderate. It's based on a shared identity as a ranching, farming place, but urban. It's a city after all. It remains relatively conservative, as agriculturally based communities are, but not reactionary, richly multiracial. And even though it's dominated by a vibrant Latino culture, it's still inclusive of Japanese, Chinese, and Filipino American communities that trace their roots to the mid-19th century, and Anglo-Americans from a wide range of European immigrant groups. It's an urban mosaic of multiracial agriculturalists. But it's not, I don't want to paint too pretty of a picture here. Power is not shared equally, and tension prevails. The wealthiest, most elite Salinas citizens may have originated from the impoverished Dust Bowl, but their race certainly gave them far more access to the highest levels of agriculture than, say, anyone from the Filipino community. Salinas always used cultural inclusiveness as a way of papering over imbalances in power, but that may be a facade in maintaining a power structure that privileges whites. It also, however, instills a feeling that everyone belongs here, everyone is important, everyone deserves representation and recognition, safety, support, and that evidence is in its new representation on the city council with women, Latinos. The mayor, Kimberly Craig, is a woman. A gay Asian council member has just been elected. Women are heads of city departments, including Fire Chief Michelle Vaughn and Police Chief Adele Frise, but also Kirsten Lundquist from Parks and Rec, and Mila Rianto, who runs the library. In the Grower Shipper Association, the staff and membership includes women and women from a variety of ethnic communities, and whose president, Chris Valdez, is a Latino man whose grandfather was a bracero. So as a majority Latino city with a significant Asian and white population, Salinas offers a rare look, I believe, at how the next phase of American urban life can be, how it can perhaps withstand the twin forces of radical politics on the right and the left, and a pandemic that has brought this economy to a standstill. There's always room for optimism, and I see it here. Thank you so much. And with that, I will turn to Michelle. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Carol. That was such a vibrant talk and such a rich portrayal of this book, which is truly a labor of love. I cannot wait to get my hands on it physically this fall. We had a question in the chat about when it'll be available, and Stephanie will be able to address that too. The story that you tell here is such an incredible one of looking closely at this level of integration. And Salinas is really special. It's not the only of our special California cities for holding this level of a global population within a single city. California, and this is a pitch for California history in general, California has several of those. Yes. I do call them these mosaic cities that really draw the world together. And the story you tell is not always easy, as everybody has heard just now. There's so much racial discrimination, racial violence, and all of the scar tissue that those leave behind. But I think you also tell a story of solidarity and interracial coalitions and the possibility for sort of ground up politics that really change the government over time and allow it to hold in a meaningful way a sort of responsibility for its whole citizenry, and the sort of struggle to do that in spite of racial stigma, racial segregation, discrimination, hierarchy, and so forth. So I think this is such an important story to tell. Salinas, I think, like so many other really important California cities, has just been overshadowed by Oakland and San Francisco and LA and San Diego. And I think you really sort of remind us that these jewels of racial diversity lie here in our state, but and they were born of tremendous hardship and resilience. So I want to just put two questions on the table for you. One is just a question that I have for you, and one is a sort of blend of a question that I came here with and that showed up in the chat. The first is one thing that I've seen in Stockton, where I've done a lot of work, and as you know, I care a lot about your project, in part because I think it teaches us something about other California cities that are in this sort of interstitial urban and rural space that you describe. But one thing that I've seen there is that in a city this diverse, transforming the city into one that's responsible for its whole public requires a lot of interracial, non-white solidarity. So there has to be some level of coalition building across minority groups in order to unsettle the minority control, the sort of white control of these older cities. And so I'm interested in that story of sort of non-white movement building, and given Salinas's incredible ethnic and linguistic diversity over its history, that's a difficult project. So I'm interested to hear something about that. And I'll tie into that this second question, which came from the chat, which is just as you think about managing Salinas today in light of this history, this heritage, sort of what lessons you draw from this powerful history for the future of the city and the governance of the city today.
I'll start with your first one, which is an excellent one because it's also the most challenging. And I think we find the intersections, the cultural intersections, the way non-white communities work together in two places. One is the local community college. Hartnell Community College really has pulled together representatives from all of the multiple groups in Salinas with the purpose of giving students across the board in the city a way of entree into more educational opportunities, more employment opportunities, and a way out. And I think that this California State Monterey Bay does the same thing. So that is a way of moving beyond just cultural activity and into proactively coming together across racial lines to accomplish these goals of lifting people from poverty, addressing the real problems that the city faces. The other place that this happens is in the nonprofits. And I don't think any community has as many nonprofits as Salinas. And those nonprofits are very inclusive of the multiple racial and ethnic communities. So what we see is an overlap here of activism and support, financial and volunteer support in a variety of nonprofits, including, and I'm, building healthy communities comes to mind, but there are also places that encourage students to get out of gangs, for example. And those are very well funded and very well supported in Salinas. So those are two places where multiple groups come together representing their communities to make the city a better place, right? To work together, and they don't need and necessarily include the Anglo-American community. They're separate from that. So they're focused either on housing or computers, or there's an organization called Computers, Loaves and Fishes, which does that. So we see these areas where people can come together outside of government to do good and to overcome racial and ethnic difference in order to create a common, better community. Your second question was about politics, right?
Yeah, and the future, as the person put it in the Q&A, the future of the city.
I think the future looks bright because when I look at the politics, it's just inspiring to see how the city council really does represent the population. That was not always the case. And I really look at that election in 1987-88 as critical. The city was about to be sued by individuals, by groups, because it denied representation to Mexican Americans in such a big way. And at the very last minute, it agreed to hold an election to decide on district elections. And that was a critical turning point. So I think that that is a way of making change. There are plenty of protest movements in Salinas, but making change through systems that are already in place. Does that answer? Kind of.
Yeah, no, that's great. Carol, I wish you could see this wonderful question and answer. Lots of questions are popping up with really rich material, and I have to apologize that we won't get to all of this, but I want to seed a couple of themes that are showing up in the questions. There's one set of questions about specific groups in Salinas. So first about the role of Salinas in Japanese internment. One person wanted to hear more about Salinas's role in that. And secondly, the presence and story of African Americans in Salinas. So can you comment on either of those?
I'll start with the internment, which Japanese Americans prefer to call incarceration because that's closer to the truth. And Salinas was the brainchild for this. Salinas was the city that said, oh no, we must take everyone and remove them from our community. It's impossible to manage the war with Japanese Americans in our midst. Salinas built an assembly center that was one of the most important in California for Japanese Americans. And in my book, I argue that they evaporated in plain sight because the papers, which reported absolutely everything, didn't even mention it. So it was happening in the middle of town, and it was not mentioned. And it was a brutal moment. And I use stories to illustrate just how devastating and brutal it was and how long lasting the effects are. People who are in their 80s and 90s still remember this moment with great pain. One resident told me the story of his brother, who his mom had just been widowed. The family was moved to this assembly center. The brother was playing baseball, got hit in the head, and crawled under a house, a barracks, to comfort himself, and died there because he didn't want to trouble his mother. She was under so much stress. So the internment, the incarceration, was something that the city chose to ignore. And then as a city, did not want Japanese Americans to return. There was a lot of pushback about that. That said, post 1965, people who arrived in the new migration turned out to be some of the wealthiest agriculturalists that are in Monterey County today. And I tell a couple of those stories too. That there was, and that really illustrates the disconnect between one migration and another. It's not just this homogenous community. Stage of migration really, really matters. The African American population of Monterey County started out dispersed in Salinas and Monterey and all over the area. But by the 1940s, it increasingly became concentrated in Seaside, which was adjacent to Fort Ord and the subject of my last book. And what happened is that a resegregation has happened in the Monterey Peninsula. So Mexican Americans are filtered, forced into Salinas, right? African Americans were channeled into Seaside and moved out of Monterey, Pacific Grove, Salinas, and into Seaside, where they created a community there that became the center for civil rights activism on the whole peninsula and in the whole region. And it's a very important center, and I think a really important story. And once again, it's a story that's overlooked in favor of the civil rights activism and Black communities that emerged in Oakland and San Francisco and Richmond. But Seaside had the largest population of African Americans between San Jose and LA. It was a huge number of people. And so I think that is a really important story, and resegregation becomes an important story. So African Americans in Salinas did not create a community like Asian groups did. And the reason for that is because the community centered in Seaside, which was the military base next to Fort Ord. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you. I think I'm going to smuggle in one final question if we have time. It might be an impossible one to answer on the diminishing grains of sand in our hourglass here, but
Impossible.
but there's a really thoughtful question in the chat about the school system and the segregation in the school system itself. So
yeah. The school system reflects the neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods were absolutely segregated. The exception was Alisal East Salinas, which was always a multiracial space. And people who grew up there wax eloquent about integration. And also their reluctance to have to go to Salinas High School. When they got a high school in Alisal, it was very, very big in the 1960s because they really loved the way the community was organized as a multiracial space. It worked. It was mostly working class, but it was deeply multiracial. School segregation in Salinas now is a lot more rigid, and it's based more on class than on race, but it still exists, and it reflects neighborhoods that remain somewhat segregated, even though obviously not by law. They're definitely by economics.
thank you, Carol.
Connected to race.
I can't resist giving you the last word, but I'm going to read it. It's just a line from your introduction that really struck me that I think is a beautiful representation of the talk you've just given. So if you don't mind, I will read.
I have no idea what you're going to say, but I don't mind at all.
You wrote, "This is not a story of progress nor of decline, but of struggle to get America right, socially, politically, culturally, and economically, all the while facing some of the most difficult challenges and the biggest crises of 20th and 21st century American life."
Thank you, Michelle.
I think that is very well said. You actually already said it in your talk, but I think it's a wonderful way of sort of punctuating a book and a talk that focus on, as you say, race and all of the adversity that have come with that heritage of integration and assimilation and immigration, and all of the resilience and pride and heritage that have come with that same history. So thank you for your work, Carol.
Thank you so much.
I think Stephanie is going to have officially the last word.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Carol and Michelle, for joining us today. It was great. The audience, for all of your really in-depth questions. And I know Carol will share the questions with you so that you can see some of them after this. And I just want to take the opportunity to say the Lane Center will be sending out a link to the book for purchase, hopefully this coming fall. So anyone who's registered for the event will hopefully get that from us in future months. And we really just hope that you can join us for our next event in a couple of weeks. Tuesday, March 9th, Phil Polikoff and Bob Siegel will be doing a talk focusing on the future of rural health. So thank you again, Carol and Michelle. We had a great talk today. So
thanks, everyone.
Thank you.